In Syria leaves at least 40 people dead as Moscow describes the claims as bogus. New powers to clamp down on violent crime as ministers pledge to do more if police need help. Russia demands to know why the UK won't give Sergei Skripal's niece a visa. German ministers lay flowers in Münster, where 2 people were killed after a man drove into a crowd yesterday. And a man dies in a fire on the 50th floor of Trump Tower in New York.
We'll have the latest from the Premier League. There are 2 big games today, and Rory McIlroy is hoping to make history tonight at Augusta.
Very good afternoon to you. New airstrikes have hit the last rebel pocket in the former opposition town of Eastern Ghouta. That's after at least 40 people, many of them children, and more than 500 people were injured in what opposition activists say was a chemical weapons attack in the town of Douma. Well, Moscow has rejected claims that the regime of President Assad, which it supports militarily, used chemical weapons, calling the reports bogus and very convenient for Washington. Well, the attack has also been condemned by the Pope. And a warning that this report now from Enda Brady begins with footage of young children in distress.
These images were filmed in the aftermath of a suspected gas attack in Douma since February. Enda Brady, Sky News.
The Russian embassy in London has accused the Foreign Office of failing to explain why it won't supply Victoria Skripal with a visa to visit her cousin Yulia. Well, the embassy also said authorities are deliberately withholding information on the murder of Russian businessman Nikolai Glushkov. Well, we can speak now to our correspondent Dan Whitehead, who's outside Salisbury Hospital for us. Dan, Sergei and Yulia Skripal seem to be responding very well to treatment, but this visa issue causing a bit of a stir because everything is still being kept very secretive.
Yeah, I mean, the UK government continues to describe this as distraction tactics today, as that investigation and the forensic work continues at multiple sites to find out who was behind this poisoning. OK, Dan, thank you. The government's denied the recent spate of violent attacks in London is linked to cuts to policing. It follows criticism over the effectiveness of the Met Police Force after the murder rate in the capital rose to more than 50 this year. Well, in response, the Home Office has announced plans to increase police stop and search powers and restrict access to offensive weapons.
Go back a decade.
Their ability to prevent crime in the first place.
Police in Germany are continuing to investigate why a man crashed a van into a crowd in the city of Münster yesterday, killing 2 people before shooting himself. Well, authorities have said that the man was a German national with no links to Islamist terror. Chancellor Angela Merkel said she was deeply shocked by the incident. Well, Joe Tidy is live in Münster for us. And Joe, the Interior Minister, has been speaking in the last few hours or so.
Yeah, that's right. He came here and laid some flowers earlier and then went and held a short press conference where he said that they have ruled out effectively that this may have been an Islamist-inspired attack. But this is still a horrific and tragic event, and people here, of course, minds shot straight back to December 2016 when a lorry was driven through a Christmas market in Berlin and 12 people died there. So once again, Germany is coming to terms with a horrific incident like this.
Joe, thank you. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban has cast his vote in an election that he says will decide his country's future for decades to come. Well, the right-wing leader is expected to secure his 3rd consecutive term today, following a campaign based upon an anti-migrant agenda.
We are a member of EU and we are a loyal member of all international organizations, and we are standing on the basis of the interest of our country because we love our country and we are fighting for the future of our country.
Well, let's go live now to Sky's Michelle Clifford, who's in Budapest for us. Michelle, it is likely that Viktor Orban will get in for another term. He's very Eurosceptic, very anti-immigration.
Very much so, and that's why the result of the election is not just a concern for many people in Hungary, but many in the EU this evening, and we're expecting some definitive results at around 10 o'clock our time, 9 o'clock your time in the UK.
OK, Michelle, we'll be back with you then, no doubt. For now, though, thanks very much. Well, let's return now to our top story, where at least 40 people have died after a suspected gas attack in Syria. The Pope has condemned the attack on Eastern Ghouta, whilst Moscow has dismissed the claims as bogus.
Notizie terribili
There is terrible news of a bombing in Syria.
Well, let's take a closer look at alleged chemical attacks that have happened so far in Syria. And the Syrian American Medical Society and White Helmets have documented nearly 100 suspected uses of chemical weapons in Syria since 2012. Well, in August 2013, the nerve agent sarin was used in a large-scale attack on the Ghouta suburbs around Damascus. That killed over 500 people. Then in April 2014, a chlorine attack in the rebel-held northern Syrian town of Kafr that killed 3 and wounded hundreds. In April last year, 2017, more than 80 people were killed in a chemical attack on the then rebel-held town of Khan Saykun in northwestern Syria. And the latest suspected attack in Douma brings the death toll caused by chemical weapons to nearly 2,000 civilians during the 7-year civil war. Well, let's go live to Brighton now, where we can speak to Andy Oppenheimer, a specialist in nuclear, biological and chemical weapons. Very good afternoon to you. It has been reported that it was sarin that's been used. What kind of impact does that have when people are subjected to that particular nerve agent?
Well, it's exactly 1 year, as you said, ago since the terrible attack on Khan Shaykhun, where sarin was used, and all the symptoms have been reported from today as coinciding with sarin and possibly also chlorine, because there have been burns to the eyes, there's been suffocation, pinpointed pupils, which all kind of look towards sarin or nerve agent, and also people foaming at the mouth, and multiple deaths, which is much more likely to be a warfare agent like sarin, which has been used and which they have previously used at least once, if not twice, if not 3 times, and chlorine at least 3 times since last April.
Well, yes, I wanted to ask you, because it does seem on this occasion there have been an unusually high number of deaths. We're hearing at least 40 people.
Yes, indeed, which is what points us into the possibility of sarin. And of course, the OPCW have had to investigate all of these different attacks. There's an overwhelming amount of work, particularly while it's still a horrendous war zone with bombings going on all the time, for them to actually come through with this. But from the medical people on the spot having to deal with the victims and themselves being affected as well, if they're not properly protected, if they have to rescue people in these dire circumstances, people dying in basements and so on, and of course being driven out onto the surface where they then get affected by the agent. This makes it obviously a terrible job for everybody to have to deal with, other than the actual bomb injuries, actual injuries from so-called conventional warfare.
What do you make of Russia coming out and saying that these reports are bogus and an attempt by the United States to shield terrorists?
Well, to use a famous old quote, they would say that, wouldn't they? It's getting now so that we're almost getting a bit weary of hearing Russian sort of apologist statements when things like this happen involving chemical weapons.
I said in my introduction there that, these chemical attacks in Syria are nothing new. They've happened on numerous occasions before, and I suppose most notably in 2013.
Yes, indeed. 2013 was a hallmark attack, after which Syria was supposed to have dismantled, having declared all their chemical warfare agent stocks. They had a considerable stock, probably the biggest in the world after the main superpowers. But they obviously haven't declared all of it, and they certainly didn't declare all their any of their chlorine. Some sarin has obviously been left over, and this is what they appear to be using and continuing to use.
What is the answer to stopping this kind of thing happening in the future then? Because it's happened so many times already.
Yes, indeed. Well, we had the famous red line, which during the Obama administration was not kind of adhered to. And then President Trump did, in fact, attack the airfield last year, from which the planes that delivered the sarin on that occasion were said to have come from. And this places a great challenge before the international community as to what they do next, because it looks like the Syrian government think they can get away with it, and their supporters, the Russians, also, because repeatedly these things happen and very little gets done other than having to investigate and then report back, and everybody then says, well, sarin was used, the chlorine was used, and sadly this war just is continuing with so many thousands of deaths and injuries from not just from this but from all other manner of warfare.
OK, Andy Oppenheimer in Brighton, thanks for your expertise.
Thank you.
You're watching Sky News. Coming up, there's more pressure on Labour as an anti-Semitism demonstration takes place outside the party's head office. That's in central London. Welcome back. Now, protesters calling on Labour to deliver on its broken promise of zero tolerance for anti-Semitism are gathering outside the party's headquarters in central London for a demonstration shortly. They're accusing Jeremy Corbyn of bringing his party into disrepute for dismissing allegations. Well, joining us from Westminster is the organiser, Gideon Falter, chairman of the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. Very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
What sort of turnout are you expecting this afternoon?
We're expecting large numbers to come from all over the country. We're expecting both Jews and non-Jews alike, because essentially what we've seen since the Jewish community stood together 2 weeks ago in Parliament Square and said enough is enough, we have seen 2 further weeks in which the Labour Party has contrived to make things even worse for itself. We've seen a Labour MP hounded out of her constituency party meeting just for attending that demonstration. We've had another MP, David Lammy, who has been threatened with deselection. Just this morning, there was a front bench Labour MP on the radio saying that the party's problem is really just being exaggerated and whipped up out of all proportion. We have seen members of the National Executive Committee in leaked minutes bending over backwards to exonerate anti-Semitic members of the party, or other members of the party accused of anti-Semitism. And so what we've seen is incident after incident in which the Labour Party continues to exhibit all of these behaviours, and what we haven't seen is a fair, efficient and transparent disciplinary process, because as everybody will know, these disciplinary cases in the Labour Party have been dragging on for months, in many cases years in other cases, and there is absolutely no transparency about them. So what we see is we see somebody who is suspended from the party over a case of anti-Semitism, but we then never find out what happened to them, whether there was some kind of penalty, whether they were actually even found that the allegations were proved correct. And so what we are saying is that in all political parties, not just the Labour Party, but at the moment, the Labour Party is where the problem is particularly prevalent. We need all political parties to have fair, efficient, transparent disciplinary processes. And in the Labour Party, that needs to start with Jeremy Corbyn. So we have filed a disciplinary complaint against Jeremy Corbyn. We have charged him with bringing the party into disrepute in breach of the Labour Party's rules. And we are now expecting that the party should investigate that complaint properly as an example to others.
Jeremy Corbyn has come out. He said he's a militant opponent of anti-Semitism. What more can he do?
There's an awful lot more that Jeremy Corbyn can do. We've heard for an awfully long time from him. Everyone will remember a couple of years ago when he set up the Chakrabarti inquiry into anti-Semitism. And that was also a time when he said, look, I'm sorry, there is a problem in the party. I'm going to deal with it by setting up this inquiry. The inquiry then found that there was no particular problem with anti-Semitism in the party. It was a whitewash inquiry. Baroness Chakrabarti was elevated to the peerage, the only person who Jeremy Corbyn has actually elevated to the peerage. And we then turn up 2 years later, and the problem is worse than ever. It's been left to fester. And this doesn't happen in a vacuum. This was not a problem in the days of Harriet Harman or Ed Miliband or Gordon Brown or Tony Blair. And all of the way back through the history of the Labour Party, it has been a great beacon of anti-racism, of equality. And it's only with the ascent of Jeremy Corbyn that people seem to have got the signal that they won't be punished if they engage in anti-Semitic behaviour. And so that what we are calling for...
Jeremy Corbyn did go to a Judas event, though. I think it was last week, wasn't it? So he clearly does have support among some Jewish people.
There will always be fringes in any community, But the point is, this was actually really a two-fingered salute to the Jewish community in certain ways by going to that event, because the mainstream Jewish community, of which I am part and which the vast majority of the Jewish community is represented by, has been trying to get Jeremy Corbyn to deal effectively with claims of anti-Semitism. And in the midst of this crisis, some might say the greatest leadership crisis that he has faced in his time as leader, in the midst of that crisis, he decides that that is his moment to go and meet with a group of people who say that there is no real anti-Semitism problem in the party, and who go on to, I think they took the refrain of the Jewish movement, which so far has said enough is enough, and they took that and they turned that into enough is enough, F you all, which is a very clear rebuff to the Jewish community's message that something needs to be done. Now, Jeremy Corbyn may have said that I went to that event, not assuming anything, not realizing what was going to happen. What I'm very surprised by, or perhaps I shouldn't be, but what I think is very, very disappointing, is that following that event, Jeremy Corbyn has not made any statement saying, I heard what was going on there, I found it incredibly uncomfortable, I wish I hadn't had gone if I'd known that was going to happen, not realizing what was going to happen. What I'm very surprised by, or perhaps I shouldn't be, but what I think is very, very disappointing, is that following that event, Jeremy Corbyn has not made any statement saying, I heard what was going on there, I found it incredibly uncomfortable, I wish I hadn't had gone. If I'd known that was going to happen, I wouldn't have gone. And so we're sitting in this position where we have had to, against all of our wishes, take on the Labour Party, which has always been the ally of those of minorities like ours. And we've had to take the action now of taking Jeremy Corbyn to disciplinary proceedings. And we expect that the Labour Party must investigate our disciplinary complaint properly and thoroughly.
OK, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for your time. Well, let's cross over now to the Sky Sports News studio for an update.
Coming up, we'll tell you why it could be a day to remember for this man, Rory McIlroy, at Augusta. He has his sights set.
This is Sky News, the top stories this hour. At least 40 people have died after a suspected chemical weapons attack in eastern Syria, but Moscow has described the reports as bogus. The Community Secretary says if the police need extra powers to tackle a spate of violent crime in London, which has left 3 teenagers dead, then ministers will listen. And Germany's Interior Minister has said that there doesn't appear to be a terrorist motive, but every avenue will be explored after 2 people were killed by a driver who then shot himself in Munster yesterday. A man has died after a fire at Trump Tower, where his 50th floor apartment was engulfed in flames. Well, President Trump has tweeted that the fire was very confined due to the quality of the building. As Emma Birchley now reports.
50 stories up, black smoke billows from an apartment in the New York skyscraper that shares its name with the US president. There's no doubt, had they spread, this would have been a tragedy on a different scale. Emma Birchley, Sky News.
Banning the sale of acid to under-18s and tougher restrictions on buying knives online are among new measures being announced by the government to tackle violent crime. Well, earlier on we spoke to Andreas Christoforous, a victim of an acid attack, who told us why he's now campaigning to make it harder for people to get their hands on dangerous substances.
I was, in December 2014, I opened the front door of my house in Truro, Cornwall, and instantly received a beaker of concentrated sulfuric acid thrown in my face, leaving me with obvious full facial scarring. I'm blind in my left eye, I'm partially sighted to my right. I have scars all down my torso and my arm. To date, I've lost count of how many surgeries I've had. I gave up counting, I think, after 4 or 5. I'll be having surgery for the rest of my life. There's no doubt about that. I will be carrying the scars to the day I die. I've recently been told my eyesight has the chance to, it's potentially going to deteriorate further. And at this moment in time, there isn't any operation that can stop that. So I'm facing potentially a future of blindness. It's been obvious to people who want to carry out these attacks or want to hurt somebody more than what is imaginable. That carrying acid doesn't carry much repellent. It carries much less repellent than a knife than a knife or a gun would. And on the first night when I was attacked, my wife and my mother were sat down by the doctors and were told they didn't think that I'd make it through the night. That puts me in the same category as being shot. I can tell you now, I would much rather been shot or stabbed than received a beaker of sulfuric acid to the face. Most of the attacks that have happened to date are not from underage people under the age of 18. There has been some. An age restriction isn't enough. Prohibition doesn't work. I'm not saying that we shouldn't make it harder to get it, but we should be concentrating on tougher sentences and giving the police the right tools to help them on the streets.
For us there, telling us his story after being attacked in 2014. Now, 20 years ago this week, the Good Friday Agreement was signed, an historic achievement that few would have thought possible in the darkest days of the Troubles. But the deal faces new challenges, with the breakdown of power sharing in Stormont and the threat of a hard border after Brexit. Sky's Neil Patterson sat down with the Irish ambassador to the UK, Adrian O'Neill, and started by asking him just how important the agreement was.
Well, I think it was an amazing achievement, really. Expect of a positive outcome.
You're watching Sky News. Coming up, Lewis